Are you tired of constantly spinning in the wet, making mistakes, and just not being able to be consistent when driving in the wet? Well, you've come to the right place, not only to help you get faster in the wet, but to be more consistent and stop making so many mistakes and spinning the car out. So there's a few things I want to talk about in this video. Obviously the most important thing is your driving, but there's a few things we want to have a look at regarding the setup of the car. So the first thing we want to have a look at before we even start driving in the wet is the setup. Now, if you are in a race that has random conditions, or changeable conditions, so what that means is it maybe starts dry and then rains later in the race, or it starts wet and goes dry. You don't want a wet setup that is just for the wet, because when it starts to dry, you're then going to be slower because you're on a full wet setup. So rather, you want to create a sort of balanced setup. So if the race is going to be dry and wet, what I personally would do is I would go to the aggressive default setup and try and make a balanced setup from that. Now, how can we do this? Well, a few things that I would recommend adjusting. The first would be to put your toe to 0 on all wheels. Now, tyre pressures in the wet are quite difficult because of the changing conditions and the constantly changing temps. However, you want to aim between 30.5 and 30 psi for the wet tyre pressures. The next, and arguably one of the most important things, is the electronics. Now, when on the electronics tab, you will notice this little box here, and it gives you a guide for what traction control and ABS settings to use for different conditions. So for the McLaren, I personally use between 4 and 5 traction control for the wet conditions, and ABS between 5 and 6. Now, do this based on your own personal preference and what you find most comfortable. And a very important thing as well is the ECU map, and that is your engine mode. So I will put a link in the description down below, and that gives you an idea of what engine map to use for each car, for each condition. I personally keep it in engine map 1 for all conditions in the McLaren. However, if you're really struggling, it may be better to increase the engine mode, and that will give you a more progressive throttle input, and then it will in turn allow you to stay in control of the car better. If you're going to be in wet conditions for the entire race, another tip is to use brake pads 3, which work in colder temperatures. Now, the mechanical grip, there's lots and lots of things you can adjust for your setup to make it better in the wet. But if you're trying to create a balanced setup, what I would recommend doing is, whilst you're driving in the dry conditions, maybe use whatever brake bias you would in the dry. However, when it turns to wet, put your brake bias all the way down to 50, and that will prevent so much locking up. When driving in the wet, you want a really soft car, so the weight transfer is a lot softer. So how we can achieve this is by softening the roll bars and softening the rear weights. So just try the setups out, see what it's like, but these are just a few of the things you can adjust to try and make the car a bit softer. You can also adjust, soften the bump stop brake as well. You can also adjust the dampers and make them a bit softer for the wet conditions as well. And then on the aero, you can also increase your aero to try and get a bit more downforce in the tricky wet conditions. However, if your race is going to be wet the entire race, and you don't need to worry about your setup being able to be compatible for dry conditions as well, then you can simply go to setup and use the wet preset setup, and that will give you the game's wet preset for that track, and then you can adjust the setup based on that. So the wet preset is actually quite good for the wet conditions. However, the one thing I would adjust is the traction control and engine mode and ABS are far too high. This will really cost you lap time. This is fine if you're really struggling and just want to try and get to grips for the wet conditions. However, I would personally turn these much further down. If you're just starting out and trying to get used to the wet conditions, I would maybe have your TC and ABS around about 6, depending on how wet the track is. As I said, there's a link in the description for what engine mode to use for what type of conditions. For me personally, I keep it in engine map 1. Another thing is getting experience. Now, unfortunately, if you are in a server with random conditions, you don't really know how it's going to play out. It could start dry and then rain, or it could be rain the whole race, or it could start wet and then go to dry. So you really don't know. But if you would like to try and practice in the wet conditions, you can go into single player mode, which you access from the main menu by pressing single player. You can then adjust the game mode, say you want to practice a quick race, for example, in the wet, or just do a hot lap in the wet. And now if you go to weather and track conditions, there is presets for the wet conditions. So we can practice light rain, medium rain, heavy rain, and storm conditions, because you really want to try and get as much experience in the wet as possible. The next thing I want to talk about, and arguably the most important, is the driving. So we're going to have a look at a few examples here and show you what you want to do and what you don't want to do. So first of all, let's have a look at the entry curbing. Now in the wet, you don't want to use the entry curbing. As you see here, we just slightly touch the entry curb and it will completely kick out the back of the car and unsettle it. Rather, this is what we want to do here. Get close to the entry curbing without using it. Some corners will allow you to use the apex, but do not run on the exit curbing either. Here's an example here of us being able to use the apex curbing, but not the exit curbing. It just unsettles the car. Here's a really good example. So don't use the entry curbing, but get close to it. We can use the apex curbing, but we can't use the exit curbing. But we still want to use all the track without using the entry and the exit curbing. But sometimes it will allow you to use the exit curbing, but it doesn't mean it's faster, as we see we lose delta. So with using the curbing in the wet, just because you can use a curb without spinning doesn't mean it's quicker. So for example, with the exit curbing, a lot of tracks in the wet will actually let you use the exit curbing without spinning the car out, but it will be slower. And because GT3 cars use traction control, sometimes it feels fine to drive and use that curbing, but what you don't realise is the traction control is actually cutting the throttle on the exit because it's trying to counteract the loss of grip from using the curbing. And on the entry of a corner, it's a big no-no to use the curbing, because if you use the curbing on the entry of a corner when it's wet, it will either cause you to lock up and go straight into the corner or completely spin out the car. Using the curbing on the apex of the corner in the wet conditions just varies by corner. So in the low speed corners, it often will allow you to use it because you're not going that fast. However, in some of the fast high speed corners, you might not be able to use the apex curbing because it will unsettle the car too much. But you just have to try and practice and see what it's like. But in summary, on the entry, don't use the curbing. On the apexes, use the curbing selectively. And on the exit of the corner, don't use the exit curbing. Remember, just because the car doesn't spin out when you use a curb does not mean that it is the fastest way to tackle that corner. As always guys, thanks for watching this video. If this helped you out, please leave a like and subscribe, and I'll see you again next time.